Chapter 21, A Home That Chose Him. The day continued after Lotta had left. Not heavy, not empty, just slow. Lucy placed Simon back on the kitchen table, and for a while no one said anything. Thomas began clearing the dishes, and Anna set water to boil for tea. The sounds were ordinary, small, safe. Simon stood quietly and looked around. This place was not a laboratory. There were no glass walls, no alarms, only warm hands and calm voices. Lucy leaned down and looked at him, not studying him, not worried, just present. "Do you want to come up?" she asked softly. He nodded. She lifted him into her hands, and this time she held him a little closer, not tightly, just close. He could feel her heartbeat through the fabric of her sweater. It beat steadily. Up in her room, the evening sun fell through the window. Mia was already lying on the bed, blinking lazily at them. Lucy sat down on the floor with her back against the bed, holding Simon in her hands in front of her. "It's going to be strange," she said honestly. "That she'll come again." "Yes," he replied. "But it's okay, right?" He looked at her. "Yes." Because it was. It was strange. It was big. But it wasn't dangerous. She placed him back on the shelf and began straightening his little bed, folding the cloth a little smoother, adjusting the lamp. He watched her while she did it. She wasn't doing it because she had to. She was doing it because he was there. From downstairs, he could hear Anna and Thomas speaking quietly together. Not about the project, not about fear, just about everyday things. It was almost surprising. The world had not exploded. It had simply changed. Lucy turned off the main light but left the small lamp on a little longer. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he replied. She lay down in bed, and Mia jumped up and curled beside her legs. Simon lay down in his small box and looked up at the ceiling. He thought about Lotta, about the glass, about the words that had been spoken. He thought about Lucy, about the shark tunnel, about her hand beside the shelf. He didn't remember his whole life, but he knew what he felt, and right now, that was enough. He closed his eyes, not with fear, not with doubt, but with a calm that hadn't been there before. The house breathed around him, and for now, it was home. Chapter 12, Light Behind the Eyelids. Night lay quietly over the room. Lucy slept with her hand resting close to the shelf, as if she were unconsciously standing guard. Mia lay curled near her legs, and the faint purring was like a distant engine in the darkness. Simon did not sleep peacefully. At first it came as a feeling, cold, not the kind that comes from an open window, but a metallic cold that crept into the skin. Then came the sound, a low humming. It grew. He stood in a room. The walls were smooth, glass, metal, reflective surfaces that twisted his own shape so he could barely recognize himself. The light was sharp and clinical, without warmth. There was a machine in the middle of the room, round, enclosing, a ring of metal with a transparent capsule in the center. The alarm began to flash. Not loud yet, just a rhythm. Red light pulsing along the edges. He could hear his own breathing. Faster. A woman stood on the other side of the glass. He could not see her face clearly, only her eyes. They held something between pride and worry. She said something. Her voice was muffled through the glass. "It's okay," she said. He knew it even without hearing it clearly. She placed her hand against the window. "I love you." The words were clear this time. The machine began to vibrate. The hum turned into a sharp tone. The alarm grew louder. The red light flashed faster. He felt the floor beneath him shaking. "Stop!" she suddenly shouted. Her hand slammed against the glass. He saw her mouth forming his name, but he could no longer hear it. The light grew, too strong, too white. It burned behind his eyelids even when he tried to close them. The machine overheated. A tearing sound ripped through the room. Glass vibrated. He tried to reach his hand toward her, but his body felt heavy and weightless at the same time. The room began to shrink, or he did. He could no longer feel his feet. Only light, only heat, only her voice fading further away. And then, darkness. Another sound, not an alarm, music. A rhythm pounding through wooden floorboards. He lay on something hard, wood. A shadow moved over him. A foot came down toward him. He tried to shout, and woke. Simon sat up abruptly inside his little cardboard box, his body soaked with sweat even though the night was cool. His hands trembled, and his breathing came in short, quick bursts. The room was dark and quiet. No alarm, no glass walls, only Lucy's calm breathing. Mia lifted her head slightly and blinked at him. Simon placed a hand against his chest. His heart was pounding. He could still hear the words. I love you. But the face was blurred. The name gone. Only the feeling remained. He crawled to the edge of the shelf and looked down toward the bed. Lucy shifted slightly in her sleep and murmured something unintelligible before turning over and pulling the blanket closer around herself. Simon slowly lay down again. He was no longer in that room, but he knew now that it had been real, and somewhere out there, in the same world, she still existed. Or maybe she didn't. The thought hurt more than the light had. Chapter 13, Morning Light. Sleep took him again, but it was thin and restless, as if the darkness still carried traces of the flash of light from the dream. He drifted in and out of short, broken images. A hand against a window, a voice saying that everything would be okay. Each time he almost sank completely into sleep, the feeling returned. Not like a scream, but like an emptiness in his chest. When he opened his eyes again, it wasn't because of light. It was sound. Soft footsteps across the floor, drawers opening. The fabric of a sweater sliding over skin. Morning. Sunlight lay faintly across the room, and Lucy moved around with a quiet energy, as if she were trying not to wake him. The ends of her hair were still slightly damp, and she pulled a sweater over her head while glancing toward the shelf. She noticed he was awake. "Good morning," she said softly, almost carefully, as if she didn't want to break something fragile. "You can go back to sleep if you want. I left some food and a drink for you." Simon slowly sat up inside his little box. He could see down on the desk where a small saucer with pieces of bread was waiting, and beside it stood a shot glass filled with milk. It looked almost ceremonial in the morning light. He smiled faintly. "Thank you," he said. She lifted her bag over her shoulder and walked closer to the shelf so her face came nearer to his. She looked tired, but not heavy. "Just awake. Are you okay?" she asked. He hesitated. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. She sat down on the edge of the bed and leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "Okay." Simon took a deep breath and began to explain. About the room, about the glass, about the alarm, about the machine that glowed too brightly, about the woman on the other side of the window, about the hand pressed against the glass, about the words. "I love you." Lucy said nothing while he spoke. Her face grew more serious, not frightened, just attentive. Her eyes stayed on him the entire time. "It felt real," he finished quietly, "like I was actually there." She nodded slowly. "That doesn't sound like a normal dream," she said honestly. He looked down at his hands. It felt like something went wrong. For a moment, she simply watched him. Then she reached out and rested her finger beside him on the shelf so he could lean against it if he wanted. "We'll take care of you," she said calmly, no matter what it was. He looked up. Her eyes were clear in the morning light. Not childish, not naive, just steady. Something inside him settled. Not because he had answers, but because he wasn't carrying it alone. "Thank you," he said softly. She smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't try to be big, but is simply real. "I'll be home again at 3, she said as she stood up. "Try to sleep a little more." She walked toward the door, turned briefly, and gave a small wave before running down the stairs. The room grew quiet again. Simon lay back inside the box and pulled the cloth around himself. The sunlight had grown stronger now, and he could hear the house settling after the morning's movement. The dream still lingered inside him, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. Not after her words. He closed his eyes. And this time, sleep came without light. Chapter 14. What They Couldn't Ignore. Lucy came home from school a little after 3, and the house once again filled with the living sounds of footsteps, bags being set down, and voices moving through the rooms. Simon had been waiting. Not restless, but with a knot in his stomach. It wasn't until after dinner that he told it again. He sat on the dining table, and Lucy had picked him up and placed him closer to the middle so he could see them all. Anna and Thomas listened without interrupting. He told them about the dream, about the room, about the glass walls, about the alarm that flashed, about the machine, about the hand against the window, about the words. When he finished, the room grew quiet. Not a skeptical silence, a heavy, thinking silence. Thomas leaned back in his chair and slowly rubbed his chin. "That doesn't sound like a normal dream," he said honestly. Anna looked at Simon for a long time, as if she were trying to read something in him that couldn't be seen with the eyes. "Does it feel like a memory?" she asked. Simon nodded slightly. "Yes." Lucy sat with her elbows on the table, looking between them. She didn't say anything, but her gaze was steady. "If that's true," Thomas said slowly, "then it means this wasn't just a coincidence." "But we don't know enough yet," Anna added calmly. "We shouldn't jump to conclusions." She turned her eyes back to Simon. "You're staying here. No matter what, we'll figure it out together." The words weren't dramatic, not loud, but they were firm. Simon felt some of the weight in his chest loosen a little. That evening, Thomas closed the window completely and added an extra lock. Anna checked the news without saying anything, while Lucy sat beside her drawing small sketches of how she could make the shelf even better for him. No missing persons, no machine, no explanation. Thursday slipped into Friday. Lucy went to school as usual. Simon began moving more freely around the shelf and the desk. Mia followed him with calm eyes, but without the hunting shadow in her gaze. Thomas worked from home on Friday morning and sat down at the table for a while to speak with Simon alone. Not like an interrogation, more like a quiet conversation between two people trying to understand something neither of them could fully see. Anna made small adjustments in the room. A low edge along the shelf so he wouldn't fall. A small lamp that could give him light without blinding him. The house began to adapt to him. Not dramatically, just naturally. Saturday morning arrived without an alarm. No school, no work. Lucy slept late, and when she woke up, she picked Simon up and carried him downstairs for breakfast. He sat beside her plate, and for the first time it didn't feel strange, just different. He began to laugh more easily, to eat without looking over his shoulder, to speak without hesitation. And as the weekend opened in front of them, something new began to grow inside the house. Not just worry, not just mystery, but the feeling that whatever had happened in that room of glass and light, he had landed somewhere that had no intention of letting him go. Chapter 15. Beneath the Glass of the Sea. Saturday morning began slowly and brightly. The sun lay low over the house, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and toasted bread. The mood was different from the previous days. Not tense, not investigative, just weekend. "We could go for a trip," Thomas suddenly said while pouring juice. "The weather is good." Lucy lit up. "Can we go to Den Blow Planet?" A glance passed across the table. Anna smiled faintly. "We could." Simon sat beside Lucy on the table and looked between them. "Den Blow Planet?" he asked. "An aquarium," Lucy explained, "with giant fish, sharks, water everywhere." To Simon, it sounded like another world. A short time later, they were in the car. Lucy wore a light jacket with a chest pocket, and Simon stood inside it, hidden but able to see out if he leaned forward. The fabric was soft around him, and he could feel her calm breathing through the jacket. It felt safe. The car hummed steadily, and the landscape passed by like a moving wall of color. To Simon, even the drive was wild. Each acceleration felt like a gentle wave through his body. When they arrived, the building stood before them like a futuristic form of glass and metal. The curved structure looked like something that had landed from another world. Inside the aquarium, the light was dim and bluish. Water moved behind enormous glass walls. Fish drifted silently past, and sharks swam like shadows in the deep basin. For Simon, it was almost overwhelming. He stood in the pocket and looked out while Lucy discreetly held a hand over the opening so he wouldn't risk falling. "Isn't it amazing?" she whispered. He nodded. The water moved slowly, majestically. Light broke through the surface in soft beams. For a moment, he forgot about machines and glass rooms from the dream. Here, there was glass too, but it held water back, not people inside. A small moment almost went wrong when Lucy leaned too far over a railing to look at the rays. Simon lost his balance for a second and grabbed the fabric inside the pocket, his heart jumping into his throat. She felt the movement immediately and straightened up. "Sorry," she murmured quietly. He smiled. It was just hi. They moved on through the exhibits. At a smaller tank where colorful fish swam close to the glass, a little girl stood nearby, maybe 7 years old, with braids and a pink jacket. She stared intensely. Lucy stopped beside her. The girl squinted. "Mom," she said slowly, "there's something in her pocket." Her mother smiled distractedly without looking. "It's probably just a keychain." "No," the girl insisted. It moved. Lucy froze for a brief moment. Simon had leaned forward slightly to watch a fish that flashed silver in the water. He quickly leaned back again, but it might have been too late. The girl took a step closer and stared directly at the pocket. For a moment, their eyes met. She didn't look scared. She looked amazed. Simon slowly raised his hand, not dramatically, just a small movement. The girl's eyes grew wide. "I knew it," she whispered. Lucy smiled nervously and discreetly turned away while pulling the jacket a little tighter around herself. They walked on. "She saw you," Lucy whispered when they reached the other side of a pillar. "Yes," Simon said. "Was it dangerous?" He thought for a moment. "No. It didn't feel dangerous. Just strange." The day continued without bigger incidents. They watched seals being fed. They walked through the tunnel beneath the shark tank, where the water curved above them like a living ceiling. Simon stood quietly in the pocket and looked up at the enormous shadows gliding overhead. He felt small, but not insignificant. Later, when they walked back toward the car, the sun had begun to sink lower in the sky. Lucy gently placed a hand over the pocket. "That was a good day, wasn't it?" Simon leaned against the fabric. "Yes," he said quietly, and for the first time since the dream, the world didn't feel like something he had simply been thrown into. It felt like something he was part of. Chapter 16. Between Light and Realization. The car moved steadily through the afternoon light while the landscape outside grew flatter and more open. Lucy leaned back in her seat with the seatbelt crossing her chest, and Simon stood half hidden in her breast pocket. He could feel the steady vibration of the engine through the fabric and her calm breathing, slowly growing heavier with tiredness. They were all a little quiet now. The day had been long, full of impressions. When the fuel indicator blinked low, Thomas turned into a gas station along the highway. Neon colors and glass walls stood sharp in the soft evening light. He stepped out to refuel while Anna and Lucy went inside the shop to find something to drink. Simon felt Lucy move through the doors. Cool air and the mixed smell of coffee, sugar, and gasoline filled his nose. The shelves were tall like walls, and the lighting was bright. Lucy walked slowly past the refrigerators. They were both tired, not exhausted, just that heavy calm that comes after a good day. Then Simon saw her. A woman stood farther down the aisle near the shelf with water bottles. Her hair was loosely tied at the back of her neck. Her movements were slow, as if she had slept too little for several days. She didn't look like someone who was simply shopping. She looked like someone searching. Something inside Simon tightened. His gaze lingered, a sharp pull in his chest. Not pain, more like a sudden weight. He whispered almost soundlessly, "Mom?" Lucy froze. "What did you say?" she asked quietly without moving her head. Simon couldn't take his eyes off the woman. Small fragments flashed through his mind. Glass, light, a voice. The same warmth in her eyes. "I don't know," he said faintly, "but something feels." He couldn't finish the sentence. Lucy glanced discreetly toward the woman. She looked ordinary, tired, but there was something in her eyes, an emptiness that didn't belong on a Saturday evening. Lucy walked calmly over to Anna and lightly tugged her sleeve. "Mom," she said softly, "Simon thinks, maybe, it's her." Anna looked first at Lucy, then down toward the pocket. Simon's face was pale, not frightened, overwhelmed. Anna turned her gaze toward the stranger again. She hesitated only a moment before making a decision. "Stay here," she said calmly to Lucy. She walked toward the woman without rushing, but with a quiet confidence. Lucy remained by the refrigerator, her hand resting discreetly over the pocket. Simon couldn't hear what they said at first. He could only see Anna speaking quietly. The woman frowned at first, confused. Then her face changed, not fear, shock. She took a step back. Her hand flew up to her mouth. Anna said something else, slowly, clearly. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head slightly, as if she didn't dare believe what she was hearing. Then the tears came, not violently, just quietly. She whispered something. Anna briefly placed a hand on her arm, not dramatic, just human. They spoke a little longer. Anna pulled a small notebook from her bag and wrote something down. She handed the paper to the woman. The woman nodded. She said one thing that made Anna fall completely silent for a moment. When Anna returned, her expression had changed. Not panicked, but heavy. She said her son disappeared, Anna said quietly to Lucy, a few days ago. Simon's heart pounded. She didn't want to explain everything here, Anna continued. She said it's a project, something secret. Lucy stared at her with wide eyes. "She's coming tomorrow," Anna said, "to our house." Simon felt his legs almost give way beneath him, even though he stood safely in the pocket. Was it her? Lucy whispered. He didn't know. He had seen her eyes. They had felt right. But the memory was still broken. They walked back outside. Thomas closed the fuel cap and immediately noticed that something had changed. What happened? He asked. Anna explained briefly as they got back into the car. The mood was no longer simply weak and tired. It was tense, careful. Thomas drove away from the station in silence. Are you sure? He asked quietly. No, Anna answered honestly, but she knew something. And she was crying, Thomas. Simon stood inside the pocket and looked forward through the windshield. The evening sky had grown darker, and the streetlights were beginning to glow. Something inside him had awakened. Not the full truth. Not names, not addresses, but a feeling. A thread. And tomorrow, it might finally be pulled free. Chapter 17. The night before. When they returned home, the house was the same as always. The same smell of wood and kitchen. The same lamp above the dining table. The same sound of Thomas placing his keys in the bowl by the door. And yet everything felt slightly shifted. Simon stood in Lucy's pocket as she took off her jacket. She gently lifted him out and placed him on the table, just as she had done many times during the week. The movement was soft, familiar. But her hands hesitated for a fraction of a second. Dinner was prepared almost without words. Thomas cut vegetables with calm, precise movements. Anna stirred a pot and occasionally glanced toward the table. Lucy sat with her chin resting in her hand, watching Simon as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Simon ate, but he barely tasted the food. He felt heavy. Not physically. Something inside him. A weight that had settled there since the gas station. What if it really was her? What if he had a home somewhere else? What if he had to leave? He looked up at Lucy, who had just taken a bite and now sat staring down at him with a more serious expression than usual. She smiled when she noticed him looking at her, but the smile wasn't as free as it normally was. After dinner, they went into the living room. The television was turned on, but no one really followed what was happening. Simon sat on the coffee table, and Lucy sat close to the edge of the couch so she could reach down if he needed anything. She touched him several times without thinking about it. A finger brushing his back, a hand resting close beside him. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply closeness. Later, when the house grew quiet, she carried him upstairs again. She placed him on the shelf and turned off the large ceiling light so that only the small lamp beside the bed cast a warm glow across the room. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed and looked up at him. "You're thinking a lot," she said softly. Simon took a deep breath. "If it's her," he said quietly, "then what?" Lucy didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands as if searching for the right words. "Then we'll figure it out," she finally said. He shook his head slightly. "I mean, if she's my mother, if I belong somewhere else." Lucy looked up at him again. There was something in her expression now, something more mature than her 15 years should have required. "You're not a thing that just gets returned," she said calmly. "You're a person." The words settled heavily in the room. He felt something loosen in his chest and tighten at the same time. "But I've been here," he said. "With you, with your family." "Yes," she said. There was no drama in it, just truth. "And that doesn't change?" she continued. "No matter what we find out." She reached out and let her finger rest beside him on the shelf. He stepped closer and leaned against the warmth of her skin. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something quieter, something that had grown throughout the week without anyone putting words to it. The breakfasts, the movie in the living room, the shelf she built, the way she held her hand over the pocket when she walked, all of it had settled into place. Down in the kitchen later that evening, Anna and Thomas stood speaking quietly together. "If she really is his mother," Thomas said softly, "we can't keep him." "I know," Anna replied. There was a brief silence. "But he's become part of us," she continued. Thomas nodded. "That's what makes it hard." Upstairs, Lucy lay down in bed without turning the lamp off completely. She left it on a little longer than usual. Simon lay in his small box, but he turned and shifted restlessly. The thoughts returned. Glass, light, a hand against a window, and then another image. Lucy leaning over him in the shark tunnel. Lucy saying, "We'll take care of you." Lucy saying, "You're not a thing." He stood up again and walked to the edge of the shelf. Lucy? She hadn't quite fallen asleep yet. Hmm? Thank you. She opened her eyes and looked at him in the dim light. For what? For making it feel like I belong. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she lifted her hand toward the shelf again, and he sat down beside her finger. You do, she said. This time there was no doubt in her voice. Eventually, she fell asleep. Simon stayed awake a little longer, watching her hand resting near the shelf. He could hear her steady breathing and the faint purring of Mia at the foot of the bed. What if tomorrow changed everything? The thought hurt, but it didn't hurt as much as it would have a week earlier, because now he had something to lose, and that meant it had been real. He lay down again and closed his eyes. This time sleep came slowly, but it came. Chapter 18. When the door opens. Morning came slowly. No one had slept deeply that night. Lucy woke before the alarm and lay for a moment staring at the ceiling. Then she turned her head toward the shelf. Simon was already awake. He sat with his knees drawn up, looking out across the room as if he were trying to hold himself together. Good morning, she said gently. He smiled faintly. Good morning. There were no big words, no jokes, just a silence that was full. Downstairs in the kitchen, Anna and Thomas moved more deliberately than usual. The table was cleared more carefully. The coffee machine was set out. An extra chair was pulled from the wall. No one said it aloud, but they were preparing. Lucy carried Simon downstairs and placed him on the table where he had sat so many times before. She rested her hand close beside him without really thinking about it. Time felt slow. Every car that passed outside made Lucy lift her head. Then came the sound, a car stopping, a car door closing. No one spoke. There was a knock at the door. Not hard, not hesitant, just a knock. Anna walked over and opened it. The woman stood there. She looked even more tired in the daylight, as if the night had given her no rest. Her expression was careful, almost afraid of hope. Thank you for letting me come, she said quietly. They stepped aside and let her enter. She walked a few steps into the house, and then she saw him. Simon stood on the table, not hidden, not concealed, just there. For a moment she stood completely still. Then it came. The air left her lungs in a broken breath. Her hand flew to her mouth. Simon. His name sounded different in her voice. Not the way Lucy said it, not the way Anna said it. It sounded like something that had been missing. She took one step forward, then another. It's you, she whispered. Simon felt something inside him react before his thoughts could catch up. Recognition without an image, warmth and pain at the same time. She knelt beside the table. Tears now ran freely down her cheeks. You're here. You're here. She shook her head faintly as if she didn't dare believe it. But you're so small. She slowly reached out her hand, carefully, so she wouldn't frighten him, but stopped before touching him. Simon stood still. He didn't clearly recognize her face, but he recognized the feeling, the same one from the dream. The same hand against the glass, the same voice that had said, I love you. His heart began to pound. Lucy stood behind him. Her hand was still close beside him, not touching, but ready. The woman looked at Anna and Thomas with shining eyes. He's my son, she said quietly. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just true. Simon took a small breath. He began. His voice trembled. I can't remember everything. She nodded quickly. That's okay. That's okay. She looked at him again, as if trying to take in every part of him at once. I thought I had lost you. The words hung in the air, and no one in the room was quite the same anymore. Chapter 19. What went wrong? A moment passed before anyone sat down, not because there weren't enough chairs, but because the truth demanded they remain standing a little longer. Eventually, Anna quietly pulled out a chair for the woman. She sat, but kept her eyes on Simon the entire time, as if he might disappear again if she blinked too long. My name is Lade, she said, her voice still uneven. I am your mother. The word hung in the room. Simon didn't feel shock, not a clear recognition. But something inside him settled into place, like a missing piece finally sliding into position. I know you don't remember everything, she continued gently, so I'll explain it slowly. Thomas sat down across from her. Lucy stood close to the table, her hand resting discreetly behind Simon, not touching him, but near. Lot took a slow breath. The machine wasn't meant to be dangerous, she began. My parents originally worked on it. It was their project. I took it over later. She folded her hands together in front of her as if holding something invisible together. It was a teleportation machine. 2 units, a sender and a receiver. The idea was simple, to send something from one place to another and back again. She looked down for a moment before continuing. We tested objects first. A cup, upkit, small items. It worked. Simon could almost picture it. Then we tried animals, she said more quietly. A rabbit, a dog. They came back. No injuries. Lucy took a slightly sharper breath but said nothing. The next step? Lottie closed her eyes briefly. Was a human. She looked directly at Simon. You were there that day. You had been in the laboratory with me many times before. You were curious. You understood more than I thought. Simon's heart began beating faster. I said no, she continued quickly. I refused you. I didn't want you inside that machine. Her voice cracked slightly. But you were stubborn. You said it would be historic, that you would be the first, that you trusted me. She shook her head faintly. I should have stopped it. I should have shut everything down. The room was completely silent now. The machine started normally, she said. It scanned. It locked the coordinates, but then it couldn't read your body correctly. Thomas leaned forward slightly. It registered you, she explained, but as if your data was breaking apart, as if something was interfering with the signal. Simon felt a faint echo inside his head. The alarm. I ran to the capsule, she continued. I tried to open it. I hit the glass. I could see you inside. Her hands clenched. You looked at me. Simon's vision blurred for a moment. You said that you loved me. She had to stop for a second to gather herself, and then you disappeared. There was no dramatic tone in her voice, no theatrical movement, just that word, disappeared. The machine collapsed, she said quietly. The coordinates were empty, no receiver, no return. Anna spoke for the first time since the beginning. And you didn't tell your supervisor? Lottie looked up. If I had, the project would have been shut down immediately. Everything would have been confiscated. I would never get access again, and I couldn't give up on finding him. She looked at Simon again. I thought I had lost you forever. Lucy looked down at Simon, and her expression was not hostile, not protective in an aggressive way, just worried. So he wasn't made small on purpose? Thomas asked calmly. No, Lottie answered without hesitation. That was never part of the design. Simon stood quietly on the table. He looked at her. There was no malice in her face, no hidden plan, only guilt and love. I can't remember everything, he said slowly. That's okay, she whispered. He looked at Lucy, then at Anna and Thomas. But I remember that I felt safe. Lottie's eyes filled again. You were. The room felt smaller now, not because the truth was easy, but because it had been spoken. And for the first time since that day in the room of glass and light, they all stood in the same reality, without secrets, only consequences. Chapter 20, Choosing What is Right. No one spoke for a long time after Lottie finished telling the story, not because they didn't have questions, but because they all understood one thing. There was no quick solution. Thomas broke the silence first. Is there any way, he asked calmly, to make him normal again right now? Lottie slowly shook her head. No, not without understanding exactly what went wrong. If I try something too quickly? She stopped and swallowed. It could make things worse. Simon felt the words like a weight, not because he was disappointed, but because reality was becoming clearer. Anna folded her hands in front of her. And taking him back to the laboratory? That would be risky, Lottie said immediately. The machine is officially shut down. The project is hidden. If anyone discovers that he exists, that this happened, then I lose control of everything, and he loses his safety. She looked at Simon. I will not put you in danger again. There was no drama in her voice, only truth. Lucy stood quietly beside the table. Her hand rested behind Simon without touching him, not to pull him away, not to hold him in place, just there. Simon looked from one person to the other. He could feel that something in him recognized Lot, not her face completely, not the memories, but the feeling. And yet, when he looked at Lucy, his shoulders relaxed automatically. When he looked at Anna and Thomas, the world felt stable. He began. His voice was small, but the room listened. I can feel that you're my mother. Lot's eyes filled with tears again, but I can't feel my life there, he continued honestly. I can't remember it. I can't see it. The silence was heavy. Here. He looked around the kitchen. Here I know where things are. I know how it feels. Lucy said nothing. She just watched him. Lot closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was no struggle in them. Only love. You should stay where you feel safe, she said quietly. It cost her something to say it. You could hear it. I don't live far away, she continued. I can come. I can keep working. I can find out what happened without tearing you away again. Anna leaned forward slightly. You're welcome here, she said calmly, as long as it's about him, not the project. Lottie nodded. It's only about him. Thomas looked at Simon. Yup, and we don't rush. No pressure. No secret tests. Simon nodded. Something in his chest felt both heavy and light at the same time. Lotte slowly stood up. She stepped closer to the table and knelt again so she was level with him. She reached out her hand. This time, Simon didn't pull away. He stepped forward and placed his tiny hands against her finger. She didn't cry loudly, but her shoulders trembled slightly. I lost you once, she whispered. I won't lose you again. You won't lose me, he said. It wasn't a promise to stay. It was a promise not to disappear. Eventually, she stood again. Lucy walked with her to the door. Simon stood in Lucy's hand now, lifted high enough that he could see out the window. Lotte got into her car. The engine started. She looked up at the house one last time. Then she drove away. The kitchen was quiet afterward, not empty, just quiet. Lucy looked down at Simon. Are you okay? He took a deep breath. Yes, he said. And this time it was true, because he hadn't been taken. He hadn't been rejected. He had been chosen. And for the first time since the light of the machine vanished, the future didn't feel like a fall. It felt like something that could be built. Slowly, together.